Hello everyone, my name is Josh at DNS Filter, and we are very glad that you're able to make it for this webinar today, and we think it's going to be very informative for you. So just a little bit of information about us. We're a content filtering and threat mitigation provider, and we operate at the DNS or the domain name system level, and this is where applications like web browsers and email clients translate names like google.com into IP addresses. So we've found that that is a very good area for content filtering and for security. So let's go ahead and look at our agenda this morning. First, we're going to go over what is phishing. We're just going to get a quick definition that covers the essential elements of what phishing is. Then we're going to go ahead and go over the impact of phishing and explore inside of a phishing attack, and then talk about some mitigation techniques and take any questions. So what is phishing? Phishing is when someone sends an email that impersonates a trusted party, such as a bank or a credit card or company that you do business with, so that you give up sensitive information. So you can see here I've highlighted three key elements that make up a phishing attack. So the first is impersonation. And this is why phishing is so tricky. It's not an obvious thing. It's something that has the appearance of legitimacy. So more than any other type of computer attack, phishing has to get you to think that it's real. This is kind of like the Secret Service, where they have to discern between real and fake currency. And so users and software need to improve continually to combat these types of attacks at discerning what's real from what's fake. The second element that we've highlighted here is that the impersonation appears to come from a group that already has a level of trust. It could be simply a well-known brand name like Microsoft or Google, or it could be more specific to you, such as a bank that your business uses for its banking. So we also see the third element here, which is purpose. So phishing is meant to collect sensitive information. And we'll go over here a little bit more about that in the next slide. But this is a very singular focus for phishing in contrasted to other attacks. And then we have a little note here about spear phishing, which is the same thing, except for the scope is a lot more narrow. So it's targeting a specific organization, specific group of users. And so if you had an example of a manufacturing company, they might impersonate an accounting firm or an IT company or a materials supplier that does business with that company to make it more legitimate. So it's also helpful to go over what phishing is in contrasted to other types of attacks. So if we look at some of the different types of computer attacks here, first we have the infamous virus. This involves deploying a software package onto host devices, and the purpose of a virus is usually in large part to inflict harm on these computing devices. So it is motivated for inflicting destruction. And the attacker usually wants fame, wants revenge, could be a disgruntled customer or ex-employee with computing knowledge. Ransomware can also fall into this category, where sometimes the goal is to freeze computing resources so that you can extract payment from whoever you've attacked. Or lastly, it could be stealth. The purpose could be to open a back door so that the attacker can use that machine for another type of attack. Then we also have man-in-the-middle. So man-in-the-middle attacks don't require any software installation to the victim's device. They're simply an eavesdrop in the connection between the victim and another party, or an imitation of a trusted party. And this can take place very easily. I could go right now and set up a rogue access point in a Starbucks. I could call it Starbucks free Wi-Fi, and probably a lot of people would connect to it thinking that it's genuine. Now, the motivation for this type of attack is often information gathering, so that some other type of attack can be launched later with a lot more information in the attacker's tool belt that he can use. Then thirdly, we have the denial of service attack. This is something we hear about pretty often. It takes place over DNS usually, because this is the level that host names are translated to IP addresses. And this type of attack is aimed at doing what a virus is doing, but at a much larger scale. So really the intent of a denial of service attack is in the name. It is intent on degrading infrastructure to the point where if it can be brought offline, that's good. That's what the goal is. And this opens up to any kind of motivation. It could be politically or economically motivated. Could be from a competing business in that industry. And then lastly, we have phishing. Unlike any of these, phishing has a very, very singular purpose, and that is to collect personally identifiable information. So as we hinted at in the earlier slide, there's this impersonation aspect so that you hand over your details, such as social security number, credit card number, address. So more than any other type of attack, phishing inherently needs to be able to fake it. It needs to be able to trick you into giving up sensitive information. And phishers love email. We can see that email is very vulnerable. According to Verizon, 92.4% of malware is distributed via email. And when we're talking about phishing specifically, 30% of phishing messages are opened and 12% of phishing messages are responded to. That is, the user clicks the link in the email and visits that website. So the conclusion is email is the easiest way to deploy malware onto a target device or network, and phishers know that. Now let's go ahead and talk about the impact of phishing. So we can see from the statistics here that the most common targets of phishing are webmail or SaaS providers and payment providers. So you can see that together they make up the lion's share, about 57% of the types of emails that your users can receive. And this is what we've seen at DNS Filter. We've seen the most common things that are impersonated are Office 365, Google, and Dropbox. Now, according to Proofpoint, which is another security research firm, Dropbox is number one on their statistics, followed by financial institutions. And also, they saw that DocuSign, that document signing service, was phished. In other words, people impersonated DocuSign, had the biggest click rate of any type of phishing email. So more people were likely to believe that DocuSign was real. Now, phishing attacks account for 43% of all data breaches. So you can see it's very popular. And an interesting trend on the last chart here, according to the Anti-Phishing Working Group, which just released their Q2 2018 results, between the last quarter of 2016 and the second quarter of 2018, the use of HTTPS went up from 5% to 35%. In other words, the fact that you go to a website after you visit an email and it shows that little lock icon that it's HTTPS does not mean that it's legitimate. It just means that you have a secure connection to that website. But that site could be a phishing website. So that's a trend that we see increasing. We see in terms of the world's biggest data breaches, this isn't necessarily specific to phishing, but it just shows you the impact and who can be affected by an attack. So the biggest one on here that you can see is Marriott Hotels. And this just happened on 30th of November this year. Marriott revealed they'd been hacked and 500 million guest accounts were stolen. And the attackers actually had a foothold in their system since 2004. And so phishing costs millions in revenue, so much lost revenue. You see that really any of these big names here, Twitter, Facebook, Equifax, It's very easy to be affected. And so even if you have a large business, that doesn't mean that you're safe from this. Let's go ahead and talk about inside of a phishing attack. So there's two broad steps that phishers have to take when they set up their attack. They have to prepare their website and their domain, and they also have to prep the email package. So we'll just divide that into these two steps and go over them in turn. So when we're talking about site preparation, it is very simple for a phisher to do this, and it's very cheap. You can buy domain names for 88 cents or less sometimes. And so it may be a little bit more expensive if they're trying to get a name that's close to the real name of whoever they're trying to mimic, but it can be very cheap. Another alternative is that existing domains can be preyed upon, especially WordPress. So a phishing package could be downloaded, it could be placed onto a legitimate website, and behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the webmaster, that's what it's being used for. And phishing packages are normally very basic. Most of the focus is on what matters, the looks. And so the form code, everything that's running behind the scenes is usually very simple. It's very focused on the imagery and making the user think that they're on a legitimate website. Now, what's collected from these forms? Usually it's an IP address, login credentials, obviously. Those are usually the two minimum things that are collected, and as well as anything else that they can collect through the web browser as well. As phishing gets more sophisticated, so do large people that are able to keep up with this, such as Twitter, Facebook, anybody that performs authentication on their website. So as this gets better, phishers continually improve as well. So an example of this is sometimes when you log in from a new computer on Google, you're going to get an email in your Gmail that says, hey, you just logged in from a new device. Was this you? And so phishers know that, and that's why they collect your IP address as part of the form, so that they could use a VPN and come out at a similar IP address and perhaps not trigger that system. Now I want to call your attention to the slide right here, and notice that this is a phishing form right here. And there's a couple of indicators that we have for that. Really the main one being Google would never make a form like this, allowing you to log in with Office 365 or AOL or Yahoo or choose other account. They have their own authentication. They don't use these as partner providers. But users could easily be fooled by something like this because the background and the general appearance is very close to what Google actually uses. Now the second step is the preparation of the email. So as we take a look at this, there's two main types of emails that phishers will mimic. And that is either programmatic or transactional email or newsletters. So programmatic email is anything that comes from a system when you perform an action. So when you do a password reset, when you edit your account profile, really any of those types of actions usually trigger transactional email to come to you. And what this type of email typically looks for is for you to confirm your information. And so this is one of the things that phishers will send, just simply asking for you to confirm your information. They may say there's some account change that's taken place and they just need you to verify it. The second type of phishing email is a weekly or monthly newsletter, things which are sent out regularly. You expect them to come. And if you're not paying attention, they don't have to be very perfect with this. If there's a newsletter sent out every Friday, but if you're like anyone else and things get busy and your inbox gets flooded, you may not look at exactly what date that email was sent out. These types of emails will normally encourage you to check out new features, check out the product in some way, and get you to think that you're logging in. Now let's look at the attack timeline for what a phishing attack looks like. So first, you'll see the email package is sent to the user, and it'll utilize pre-existing lists that are available to the attacker. Then the second thing that happens is the user clicks on the link and they are taken to the phishing website. They fill out the form on this site and the attacker is notified via email. Now, what phishers used to do is log that information and send it periodically. But because of the fact that anti-phishing has started to increase in recent years, they've taken advantage of the fact that they can just send that form directly via email to themselves and then use that information instantaneously. So they'll have an email in their inbox with all of the information that you just provided in that form, along with anything that the browser collected about your locale, about your language, about your IP address, just so that they have any details they might need in order to mimic on the authentication side when they attempt to break into your accounts. Then the last step is user redirection. So often what will happen is that the user is redirected to the real login page after they've just used the form on the fake website. This way the user is actually none the wiser about what just happened. Some domains actually will have a special page for if you messed up on logging in the first time. And so they can take you directly to that page so that you think as a user that perhaps you entered your password incorrectly. And that's all that you may realize about that experience. So let's move on here to talking about mitigation techniques. So there's several things that you can do to mitigate phishing. One of the things that you can do is user education. And this is one of the best ways to combat phishing. And in concert with that, you can do phishing campaigns. So when it comes to user education, the biggest thing is training them to simply visit the trusted source directly. You don't have to click on any links in the email. You can always just go directly to your web browser, type in the domain for whoever you are trying to get to, and perform your login activity there. Another thing is to check the address bar and URL. So again, as we mentioned earlier, their phishers are able to have valid SSL encryption on their phishing domains. So the fact that you have that green lock icon doesn't mean that you're not visiting a phishing website. But in contrast, if you're going to a website and you're entering in login credentials and they don't have HTTPS, that is a sign that perhaps this is a phishing domain. Additionally, if anything about the domain name itself seems odd or does not seem to be in keeping with whoever you're trying to access, that's also a big red flag. You can also run phishing campaigns against your users. So there's two really big open source tools for this. There's Kingfisher and GoPhish. And so you can actually set up an entire campaign. You can send a phishing email to your own users at your company and test the results of that. You can see who opened it, who went, who clicked the link, who filled out the form, and you can use that to gauge how successful your user training was. Another thing that you can do is multi-factor authentication. There's a very big push to two-factor auth these days. Many big providers and websites have it. And this will allow you to have to enter your username and password as well as a rotating key. And this will help to thwart phishers. It's not a complete solution because of the fact that when users enter their login credentials, there's no guarantee that they have not also used those same credentials somewhere else. So if they're using it for Office, they may also be using it for Dropbox, and they may also be using it for their bank. So it doesn't necessarily protect you comprehensively, but it does help. The third thing that you can do is password managers. So password managers can minimize the damage to only being one site. because of the fact that you can generate a new password for every single website that you have a login to. So in combination, multi-factor authentication and password managers can effectively limit the damage from a phishing attack to only one site, which is really good. There's also 3 things that your security vendors can do. And so as we talk about these, the first one is incorporating multiple threat feeds. Again, not everybody is perfect. There needs to be multiple eyes on the situation here. And so if your security vendor only relies on 1 or 2 lists of malicious websites, it's likely that things can get through, especially with how quickly the threat landscape changes these days. The second thing is that they can graylist domains. This is basically the blocking of newly registered domains. So when we talked about the 2 types of things earlier, where phishers can either register a new domain or take over a WordPress site, for example, when it comes to registering a new domain, often phishers will register a site and be done with their attack in about 30 days or less. And so by the time people have picked up on the fact that this is being used for phishing and added it to blacklists and added it to phishing lists, it's done. The attack has already taken place and it's over. The attackers moved on and they're no longer using that domain. So if you can graylist domains so that they're not trusted for, say, a period of 30 days, that allows new domains to be vetted before they're able to be allowed in your system. The third thing is you can leverage machine learning. So AI, obviously, there's a lot of talk about it. It's transforming every industry, especially anything that relates to IT, and for good reason. It's very effective, and it's growing in effectiveness every year. But one of the things that AI can do is leverage image recognition. So AI can be trained to look at the imagery on a website and compare it to that which is used by known legitimate sources, and whether or not it is one of those legitimate sources or not. So is an Office 365 login form being used by some random .info domain? And if so, they can flag it as phishing. And so this is something that artificial intelligence does very well. So if you're able to follow all of the recommendations on this slide, you can drastically reduce the impact that phishing will have for your business. Well, with that said, we can go ahead and go to questions now. So if you've had any questions about what phishing is or how you can combat this further for your business, we can go ahead and take any of those questions at this time. Well, thank you so much for attending this webinar today. To all of you, if you have any other questions, go ahead and contact us at sales@dnsfilter.com, and we will be happy to get back to you. Thanks again.